guys, this is Mrs. Jenkins. I am talking to you today about Western expansion, and we are going to cover this today pretty quickly. There's a lot of slides to go through. The first, we're going to start with Mannafest Destiny. This term was coined by a magazine author, newspaper author, John L. Sullivan, and he basically said that it is our God-given right to expand our country from sea to sea, from coast to coast. Basically, he believed that it justified taking territories from native people and expansion overseas later on. Here's what our territory looked like in 1870. Most everybody was on the eastern coast here, and then we were talking about expanding into these blue territories from sea to sea. Why were people moving west? So this is a big question at the time. Why were people moving west? Those that moved west most of the time were farmers, ranchers, miners, loggers, people that needed work and could not get it in the east, or people that were looking for a better life. Why were they moving? Well, there were a couple of things. One was called a push factor and one was called a pull factor. And that's exactly like it sounds. Push factor is somebody behind you pushing. Some of those would be a lack of cheap land in the east. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have land. They needed a new start. Maybe they were escaping persecution religious wise. And some of the pull factors, think of a rope or somebody kind of pulling you towards them. Economic opportunities. We had a lot of free open land. We had potential riches. We had the railroad making travel easier. So a lot of those were reasons that people were being pulled in, okay? So railroads is another big thing. At this point, we're really starting to get everybody, all these railroads being built in the east. We really had a few, but now all these red ones are being built in the west. And that's really making travel a lot faster, and it's making it a lot easier for people to go from one end of the country to the other. The railroads connected the country. The U.S. government wanted Western territories settled. They offered railroad companies free land incentives to bring transcontinental railroad connecting east and west. The government let the businessmen form corporations. They could buy and sell stocks and bonds to raise money for the new tracks. Wealthier companies bought out the smaller ones, and we had the first big corporations being combined in the United States. Wealthier companies bought out smaller ones. They sold extra land that they got for free from the government to make even more money. And they were even advertising in Europe to attract new settlers into the country. Cornelius Vanderbilt was our first, what we call a robber baron or a captain of industry. He was the wealthiest man at this point in the country. Now, the connection of the Transcontinental Railroad, this was kind of like a competition. We had in the east, in Missouri, we had the Union Pacific Railway, and they were going west. And then in Sacramento, California, we had the Central Pacific, and they were going east. Now, they met right here in Promontory Point. As you can see, the Union Pacific built a lot more rail than the San Francisco's Central Pacific did, but they met in Promontory Point right there in Utah, and that's where they connected the east and the west. Alright, so some effects of the railroad growth. We had the invention of time zones. Before that, it was not really a thing. Obviously, the sun does not set in the east at the same time that it sets in the west. So they had to have time zones to regulate the railroad so that we would know when trains were coming and going. They had a standard gauge for the railroad track, 4 foot 8.5 inches. That allowed any track to be used by any train regardless of what company had built it. We had the growth of cities around the railheads where we had the railroads stopping. We had Chicago, Seattle, Kansas City. All of those were booming cities after the railroad came in. We also had industrial growth, cattle ranching, lumber, steel, coal. All of those were easily moved through the railroads to other parts of the country to allow goods and resources to be moved around. We also had a mail order service that started. Montgomery Ward's and Sears Roebuck. You could call in an order and have things shipped much quicker now through the railroad than you could before. We also had population growth in the West, jobs creating from immigrants like Colorado, North and South Dakota. We also had reduced time to travel from New York to San Francisco from 6 months by wagon train to now just as small as 10 days. Alright, so what does it look like for our farmers? Well, our farmers had the Homestead Act of 1862 that divided up millions of acres of public land in the western states. Now, again, not all of that was public, but that's how we were doing some of it. We had settlers that were getting 160 acres of land for free. The requirements were that they could have never fought for the Confederate Army. They had to be the head of a household or single, at least 21 years of age, and they could not be a woman or an African American. Neither of those two groups had rights at this point. To keep the land once they got it, all they had to do was make an improvement to it, build a house, build a shelter, put a farm, and then they had to live there for 5 years. As long as they did these two things, the land was theirs. There were no other requirements for it. And this was all through the Western Territories. Now, some of the challenges of farming in the West, very little rain, so they had to find a way to irrigate, so they used wells a lot. A lot of times they would hand water the crops. They really didn't have any other way to do it. There weren't a lot of trees for lumber in these areas, so they had to build the mud shelters. They would make them out of mud and kind of dry them out, and then that was their place to live until they could get lumber. Another problem that they had was hard soil. It was not the same soil that they had in the East. It was much harder. So John Deere invented a new steel plow that would go through the hard earth. Okay, so that was a new invention that they had to have to be able to ranch and farm in the West. So ranching, we had cattle ranching, which was new. So at this point, we had millions of cattle that were wandering in Texas mainly. The railroads made it much easier to transfer the cattle. We did have quite a few cattle trails. Here's some of the cattle trails here. They would go drive the cattle north to the railroads so that they could put them on the railroad and send them east, mostly to Chicago. That was where they butchered most of them, and they would get like 10 times what they would get if they tried to sell them in Texas. We also had cowboys. A third of those were black, Mexican, or Native American. They were not all white men with a hat smoking cigarettes, not like we think. There were also a lot of conflicts with when they would drive the cows, because a lot of the farmers didn't like the cows coming onto their land because they would eat all their grass or their crops. They would cause a lot of damage in their path. So with the invention of barbed wire right here, that really put a stop to the era of the cowboy driving the range. This was only about a 20-year period when they actually did this, but it did put a stop to that because they would have to then drive the cattle around all of these properties, and it made it much harder for them to do that. So eventually they end up putting in a rail line in through Texas, so they didn't have to do that. But some of the big trails are right here, the Chisholm Trail and the Goodnight Loving Trail, and just all of those great trails that we've heard about before. Alright, mining, lumber, and oil. So some of the bigger industries, mining, we have gold and silver mining that drew people to the areas to prospect. Mobile populations, they were looking for new hotspots, always trying to get rich quick. We had Nevada, Colorado, South Dakota, Montana, and Alaska were all big mining places. They gained lots of population during this time, enough to become states. They also had a lot of famous brands that started specifically for the miners, including JCPenney, Nordstrom's, and Levi's. Lumber in the Northwest was easy to ship east because of the railroads. They would be for housing, buildings, and furniture. And oil in Texas in the 1890s was needed for new industry and transportation. So Texas became a big oil center. Some of the environmental problems that we had with these industries, ranching, obviously large herds ate the native grasses down to the soil. It could cause erosions. Oil, we had contamination of the soil and water. Mining would cause fumes and smoke from fires. It would also dump toxic material into the streams. And then the timber industry would just cut all the trees down that helped lead to drought and soil erosion over the period of years. All right, so where were these industries located? So the mining industry right here, was in the purple areas or pink areas. So we kind of have little dots of them here, there, and everywhere. Farming, that's the green areas. Those are mostly going to be in the eastern part and a few in the western. And then the big brown areas through the center are all going to be ranches. Okay, that's going to be where ranching is located. All right, Native Americans. So we had some conflict with Native Americans. In the early 1800s, they were forced off their tribal lands, increased the number of settlers from the U.S., causing conflicts with them. We had the Battle of Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull, where the Sioux defeated Colonel Custer, and all of Custer and his troops were killed. Chief Joseph was the leader of the Nez Perce in Oregon. He tried to get his people north to Canada, but ended up having to surrender. He said, "He's tired, my heart is sick, I will fight no more." And we had the destruction of the buffalo. That was another big problem at this time. All right, assimilation. So what is assimilation? Once we had the Dawes Act come into effect in 1887, that pushed the Native Americans off their land and into reservations. Well, then people came along to the reservations to help the Native Americans, and they would take all their children and send them to boarding schools and literally beat the Native American out of them. They would Americanize them and assimilate them into basically Eastern society. However, it did not really work well. Not many successes happened during this. They had this all the way up into the 1950s. Some of these schools were not shut down until later. And none of these people that did this were ever very successful. Many times, neither the Native Americans nor the English accepted these people. Excuse me, so they were just kind of in between. All right, we also have the Dawes Act. I told you a little bit about it a second ago. Basically, it divided up all the reservation land into 160-acre plots. Each Native American family would get one plot. If they improved their plot, they could become U.S. citizens. The problem was most of the land that they were given was not farmable, and Native Americans were not farmers. They did not know how to farm. It broke a lot of the traditional structure, and it nearly destroyed their culture. It destroyed the reservation system, community property, self-government. The U.S. thought that it would make them peaceful citizens, and they profited from selling leftover land to white settlers. The tribes ended up losing 2/3 of their land, and they outlawed native culture practices. Okay, population growth in the West. Here we can see the areas that were settled during different periods of time. Pretty much everything was settled by about 1890. That's when we have our biggest part. Now, there were a lot of positives and a lot of negatives. Gold, positive, and tarnish was a negative. But just keep in mind that a lot of this goes with a lot of different things. We had a lot of the environmental negatives. We had a lot of the Indian population negatives. But we did have some positives. We had growth. We had industries expanding. And all of those fun things. So I hope you guys got through this. I know it was a lot of content. Feel free to stop and rewind at any time if you need to. And if you have any questions, just contact your U.S. history teacher. Have a great day, guys.